Hi friends, I've got the Torah study notes here that I took from yesterday's session, so I'm going to go over them for the friends who were not able to come. So basically, um, we started talking about the terebinths, which Abraham was dwelling in because he uh, needed to be the one of the theories is that he needed to be by a certain kind of medicinal tree because he had just circumcised himself. And so then when God comes with the three angels to Abraham on their way to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, there's a lot of hustle and bustle, a lot of rushing around in order to like appease these divine figures. And so I asked, why all this quickness? And one of the ideas that I had was that it related to later on where Esau is quick to get his stomach filled because he's starving, and so he ends up selling his birthright. Uh, there's also kind of a feeding of God in this at this part with the cakes that Sarah makes. Anyways, so we started talking about the angels. Alex brought up the fact that in the Talmud or uh, the Gemara, that is to say, a commentary on commentaries, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael were the angels, where Gabriel was the one who was sent to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Michael was the one who was to pronounce that Sarah was going to become pregnant in her old age, and Raphael was the one who was healing uh, Abraham because of his self circumcision. And so we talked a little bit about that Mishnah commentary, and we were saying also that the Torah could be read back and forth, that the chronology doesn't always uh, matter. And so something came up about Eden. I'm not sure what, but and then the word Adashim uh, kind of meant like the kind of beings that these angels were. But also Gabriel was mentioned in Daniel 8:9 as another reference to that angel. And then we started talking about the territory, and I was thinking like, about these Mishnah or the Gemara's readers, the rabbis, they make these interpretations, and the interpretations are read throughout centuries later. And I was wondering, why do they get the privilege of getting there first and making the most meaningful, so to speak, arguably, interpretation? Why can't, fresh readers come up with their own interpretations and be just as happy about that in their own sakes as reading from the previous authorities, these rabbis? And sometimes I think that these rabbis kind of crowded out the territory or marked their territory because they got there first in order to make these kind of meanings, which then stuck throughout traditions. And so the way I like to look at it is that it's like a toolbox where, you know, you can pull out meanings, you can make interpretations. The authority that comes from such interpretations um, sticks around if that authority was closer sometimes to the original time or just by being virtue of being ancient enough that it makes itself canonical in some ways. And I was telling everybody that I was an anti-authoritarian, so I don't understand why we can't have like why they get the first dibs on the meanings to delineate these kinds of facts or interpretations. Um, and then Rabbi Robert was talking about or both Rabbi Robert and Rabbi Alex were talking about the Talmud, where um, in this story in Sodom and Gomorrah, someone was dipped in honey and left out for the animals to get her. Um, Robert said that they did this practice in Herodotus, which isn't a Jewish text, but he said that this was kind of like a fact. But he also talked about like the fact that being closer to the stories um, and is kind of like the ripples of the very center of a drop going into the water, and then we on the outskirts are those ripples that have reached us from these forces that the pebbles made with the water's surface. So the pebbles were closer in the event of this dropping through the water, and we're farther out. Um, and then I started saying that when Alex read when Rabbi Alex read the part where Abraham started quarreling with God, I was I took up some not really an argument, but I thought that the way that Alex was reading it, it didn't show off, it didn't invigorate the tone that of anger that Abraham was feeling towards the injustice that there will be innocents who, including his brother Lot, or Lout, which is what Rabbi Diana says his name is, according to another rabbi. Um, that Abraham's angry at that the innocents will be sacrificed along with the rest of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's part of the reason why God's like in this argument almost with the haggling of the of different. If there's good people in Sodom and Gomorrah, then God shouldn't destroy it on the account of those good people. And Abraham like talks him down in kind of like a haggling way, lesser and lesser good people, so that God might not destroy it. But I was saying that there might be more anger involved in the tone, the expression of Abraham's voice than Alex was reading. And then I also asked the question about revelation and how much that counts as like knowledge, aside from the facts that we can come out from the text, always in these intertextual kind of like studies that we get theories from when we read in a more evidential way or something kind of like that. What does revelation count for in terms of knowledge? And also, I was laughing about the idea of the enjoyment of Sarah with her husband Abraham, saying that Abraham might not have done other things to make Sarah feel enjoyment other than the sex that they don't have anymore because they're older. And I was just wondering, like, well, why aren't there other kinds of pleasures out there besides sex that Abraham was could give Sarah? It makes it seem as if like Sarah's saying, am I to have pleasure with Abraham when she's talking with the Lord, and then she laughed about it, and then I was saying, well, maybe Abraham didn't like say many jokes to her or something. And Rabbi Diane, liked to say this quote: "Is anything too is like difficult for the Lord? Like when is anything too wondrous for the Lord? When Sarah denies that she's going to get pregnant again and enjoy Abraham again in sexual matters, we like this fact that God does have the power um, to do anything basically, which will come up later in this study too. So God, let's see here. God inventing in history discovers. Oh, one of the things was that that came up was that like in science things get discovered, and I was wondering like if God um, invented throughout history the discovery process so that people get facts based off of God's like finally making it happen. So there's a whole like discussion around whether or not like the pillar of salt could have happened, or how it was composed and things like that. That which comes later after the cities get destroyed, or during that process. And Rabbi Jamie was talking about the magic and the fertility and science, and I said, well, maybe laughter, because it's in context with pregnancy, maybe that's the reason why people get pregnant, because of laughter. If you think of this as kind of like an origin story, which is just kind of a silly joke on my part, but maybe there's something there. Um, and so let's see, I talked about the anger of Abraham and how I thought that he was being angry towards God in this quarrel. And Rabbi Diane said that no, she disagreed, that Abraham represents Hesed, which is love. And then Rabbi Alex said that, well, there is kind of like an urgency to love with this kind of injustice. So maybe there's some like kind of like he wants to fight for these innocents, so he gets like angry as a result. Or maybe he's projecting his own anger onto God, because he does talk about God like being angry too. And so I was saying, well, if Abraham was a mercenary from like the last study we were talking about, maybe there's some residual anger for like seeing injustices, because he has like that kind of warrior style and attitudes. And then this bargaining with God, Rabbi Joe came in, and he was wondering why this analysis. Why do we analyze all this? Why does it really matter? And why all these details? So like I was saying, well, Abraham's like protesting, and Rabbi Alex has brought up the last lectionary study, where there's a couple of lectionary studies ago about the tax collector and the Pharisee, and how one is exalted because they're humbled, and then the other is humbled because they're exalted. And so he's saying like that Abraham is kind of like this guy who gets humbled with the bless, and he has the blessing, which humbles him too. Rabbi Jamie talks about God wanting more followers, which is one of the reasons why he picks Abraham. And I was saying like it makes for a good story that God cannot just snap his fingers and make like everybody like perfect and all this. Like Rabbi Joe is kind of wondering, why doesn't God just snap his fingers and create good everywhere? And Rabbi Dan says that God has favorites, and I was mentioning that this is kind of like an origin point where, because of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, that it shows that God he has the power to punish in this story. And then we got into kind of an argument, a feeling that, especially from Rabbi Alex's sense, that Judaism is a kind of debating back and forth our feelings towards God and the texts of the Torah and other texts that are sacred. And so this argumentation that we go through is different, makes Judaism different from other kinds of religions, because it has this dynamic debate, ongoing in this open space where we engage with the Torah through these discussions of our feelings, even though we might never get anywhere or make progress. At least we're engaging with this Torah, which is a mitzvah, a commandment. And that's different from, say, like submission in like Islam, where you can't like really question like everything that goes on there. And Rabbi Diane said something about, I'm sorry, modeling, yeah. Rabbi Dan talks about us like modeling what's going on in the text as kind of a way of like entering Judaism as a Jew, and so what we do when we model the text is engage in like an understanding of the text through this kind of experiential reading of the text through modeling. And I was I said that we all have our quarrels with God, and let's see here. And I said that's what partly makes this like book awesome, because like Rabbi Joe was asking, why does God like make all these like kinds of scenes where he makes things difficult, and he even says like maybe it's a fiction or something like that, or thinks of it as a fiction. And I said, well, maybe that's why the book that's some part of what makes the book awesome. And then Rabbi Alex started talking about the GAN, the GAN, kind of adversarial training processes where a disconnector, I wasn't too it's kind of about like a computer kind of simulation of like a model for improving based off of one output, imagining fakes or making up fakes, and the adversarial training, the other side would push forward like the opposite argument against these fakes. And so like the fakes get better each time, and so each kind of like gets pushed forward throughout time. I'm sorry, Rabbi Alex, that didn't really explain the GAN idea very well, GAN, but he mentioned that. And then time travel came up somehow. And then I asked the question also, what as to why God doesn't just snap his fingers and make everything awesome. I asked the question, well, why is there evil in the first place? And then Rabbi Jamie talked about the checks and balances where you have to have like evil in order to appreciate the good. You have to have, the opposites to existing at once in order for both to exist, or else there would be just nothing. And then I thought about the idea from Newton where he talks about every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And then I realized, because of the other day I was thinking about this, that in football, if you have like a touchdown, my question is, why, if that's an action, why doesn't it always produce, the other reaction where the other team gets an opposite, gets their touchdown after the first touchdown, as like an opposite reaction, which doesn't always happen. And so we're kind of like, talking about that a little bit. And, this binaryism might work on like smaller levels, but on like some larger levels, it doesn't always work, because one touchdown doesn't always guarantee that the other other opponent is going to make their touchdown too, because it's on a more macro level. And then we started talking about the debates that humans get into, and angels came up again. And I talked about, I asked the question, why debate? Why use debate as a model? Why can't we just like point to things like our parents did? Wittgenstein came up, and then by Rabbi Alex, and I said, well, why can't we have it more like, well, actually, Wittgenstein came up because I said, why can't we have it more like our parents instead of debating, where we just agree with our parents because they're pointing to things and we're learning the language of the world by understanding what they're pointing at and all. And Rabbi Alex talks about Wittgenstein saying, well, that's what Wittgenstein said is one model, but there's many other kinds of like ways of like, other possible models that we can learn from too, which is true. And then I said, well, like in Shakespeare, we have better models than others. Shakespeare being like, in my opinion, probably inarguably the best writer out there, best poet, the best dramatist, the best thinker, over like philosophers too. So why can't we say like there is like a kind of like there are better, you know, things, and why debate in the first place is what I was asking, not in a negative sense, but also just because I was wondering like where does this like get us, as Jews or as just readers? Why do we debate? What are some other models that might even be better? And so I wrote down here, we don't think the way, oh no, Rabbi Alex said, we don't think the way we do a year ago. And he started saying, talking about the MacGuffin or the MacDuffin, which is from a Hitchcock uh, film, which there's like a briefcase, and it's a plot device to get us interested in the briefcase, and it's necessary to the plot, but in itself it has no value. And there's like a lot of talk about this MacGuffin, and then finally Alex talked about God as being the MacGuffin or the MacDuffin. And I said, well, God in a debate case, in our debate model, isn't so much a briefcase, but this debate model is a court case, where instead of a suitcase, it's a court case, where Abraham is like the ultimate like lawyer here, debating whether or not just so much debating, but arguing again for those innocents. So it's a lot like that, and the debate model of Judaism models itself on this debate model of Abraham that we were looking at. And Rabbi Joe talks about it, this literature that affects billions and billions of people that believe it and are vexed. It vexes Joe, and Rabbi Henry talked about evil as the MacGuffin, and defining evil for Henry is a personal thing where, there's like frequencies within each person that, within each like culture. I think I'm getting this right. That make it so that one culture will say like evil is this and define it as that, and another define it as that. And so this kind of cultural relativism came up in our discussion. And so I was saying, well, why can't evil be defined personally? For me, whenever I read Paradise Lost by John Milton, I think of Satan as like a bad data. I think of other like forms of evil as bad data, and like the angels as good data. So I think of them as the angels as like the true beings, and Satan is kind of just like an illusion in the story. Sometimes I read it that way, sometimes I don't. But Alex kept on talking about the MacGuffin, and the Ein Sof came up as the wondrous, like, Rabbi Dayan talked about like the Ein Sof is kind of like the part of the unknowableness of God too, because God's so high. There's like this like nothingness feeling, just like the MacGuffin, and so she liked the idea that Alex talks about God as the MacGuffin, and she applauded Rabbi Henry, and for what he was saying about like the what do we know about God? What do we know? What God thinks about good and evil? What do we know about God, good and evil? And Rabbi Diane talked about wrestling with this text too, just like Jacob did the wrestling angel. And she liked that my feeling of this kind of debate going back and forth is kind of like Judaism as a metaphor for the court case. And Rabbi Joe talked about well, there are evils. Slavery is evil. It's a wrong, and we can kind of agree on that. And Rabbi Henry said it was more about like the context of like these cultural relations and cultural relativisms. So there's kind of some going back and forth about that. And I said that Abraham is the answer to the question, why can't the individual be right? For he is right. Why can't the individual be right sometimes over other kinds of authorities that are more institutional or traditional or cultural or any kind of authority? Why does it always have to be the state over the individual? Why can't this appeal to authority be transcended by the individual herself or himself being right? And I think that Abraham's a good instance of this fact that you can have the individual being right, because Abraham does stand up for the innocents and does get his way, even though he's arguing against God, which is kind of an interesting thing we all agree on as rabbis. And so Lot was he was in Sodom and Gomorrah. We started reading about that, and the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah were very inhospitable. And Lot was right too, in a sense, because God, like as an individual, like saved him from with the angels coming in and blinding the light to the people coming in to rape Lot and his daughters. So they were able to escape because of the angels. And I was saying still like Lot and Abraham are the answer to this of this debate that we have with like God sometimes and ourselves. And the universal and the cultural, and we were saying stick to the text, Diane would say, and Rabbi Joe was talking about like Hitler being like bad too, and our debating, like as kind of like a universal bad, and debating, and by debating we can appreciate like kind of this way that we can like get a better society through like negotiations sometimes, and maybe forming consensuses as to what we value as good and evil or good and bad, so that civilly we can get along as a better society and improve and thrive as a result. Finally, we started talking about there was kind of an instance where there was some talk about like aliens and the idea of like sending up. There's a film a science fiction film talking about fighting the aliens by sending off one of their own kind, but with like things in the body, so that when the aliens took and abducted the body caused the aliens to like get destroyed. And I was saying, oh, that's kind of like the Trojan horse, idea that Homer came up with in Iliad and the Odyssey. And that's part of the messiness and the ethical impossibilities we get ourselves into. And I was saying, well, we're like kind of like art lawyers who don't get paid if we are in this debating model. Maybe that's what makes us argue even more so, because sometimes we don't get the answers being kind of like a money or a payment or a compensation for us becoming like lawyers and learning all this kind of stuff. And I wanted to end with like Rabbi Tarfon talking about wages, where he says like the people are, tired, the workers are tired, and everything's like, the day is done, and there's still things to do. Um, but he says, Rabbi Tarfon says, you're not you're not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And by saying that, I was thinking also about like this lack of compensation that we readers, as like lawyers or debaters, get ourselves frustrated about because we don't have these things. But Rabbi Tarfon can energize us, saying that we don't have to do all that we can, but at least that we stick with doing the work of like reading the Torah. We do accomplish a lot, even though we don't always get what we want by in terms of final like work, like a completion. And then I was saying that there's a difference between protesting, arguing, debating, complaining, because sometimes these are political, sometimes they're legal, sometimes they're just debates, sometimes they're just quarrels. So we said our prayers, and that was that, and we had a good study, and we learned a lot. So thanks for listening to this third week of study from our Torah group. Bye, everybody.